the Second World War. In 2024, global military expenditure rose by almost 10% in real terms when compared to 2023. This represents the largest annual increase since the end of the Cold War. We're talking about military expenditure of $2.7 trillion. We're not only talking about increased conflict between nations, nor of rapidly growing military expenditures to sustain this, but we're also talking about new forms of cruelty and death that wars now bear. We are well aware that since the very birth of civilization, the absence of violence or war has perhaps been nothing more than a pipe dream. But in our time, technological progress has unleashed other, much more perverse means of waging war, such as the use of military practices aimed at sowing fear, terror, and death among the civilian population. Let it be very clear. We condemn all forms of terrorism, since it constitutes, among other things, a despicable act of cowardice. There is another perspective, a current perspective, one that leads us to believe that the main objective of current wars seems to be the systematic practice of extermination. The end has never justified the means. We must banish that old precept that war is the continuation of politics by other means. All war is criminal, irrespective of where it occurs, irrespective of the God invoked to justify it, and it will always deserve our most visceral condemnation. It is true that every nation has the right to its own territory and government. It's true that they have the right to establish a level of self-determination that allows a nation to coexist with other peoples. And the value of the United Nations is precisely to ensure that these principles are realized in a peaceful and civilized manner. No state that claims to be democratic and to live under the rule of international law can, even under the legitimate right to defend itself against terrorism, exercise barbarity against any civilian population, least of all against especially vulnerable and defenseless persons. Since 1948, Uruguay has maintained a consistent and steadfast position in line with the principles of self-determination and peaceful coexistence. Our historic stances on the main global conflicts, especially that currently underway in the Middle East, are well known. In this regard, Uruguay has always maintained the position of two states, two peoples. The Uruguayan government hence takes very seriously the reports produced by the international community concerning the Palestinian territories and urges the implementation of the recommendations made by the United Nations. At the same time, we urge the immediate suspension of military operations of death. We urge the suspension of death of innocent civilians. And we request the release of the hostages. In our world, at the same time, there are other persistent and worsening, more widespread and permanent tragedies, to such an extent that the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, adopted in this very assembly 77 years ago, stands as a revolutionary manifesto in the times that we are living through, beginning with its first article, which proclaims all human beings are born free and equal in dignity and rights, and endowed as they are with reason and conscience, should act towards one another in a spirit of brotherhood. How far we are from our own principles and commitments. when we see that the gap between those who have the most and those who suffer the most is ever greater. How far we are when we see that the principles of freedom and equality are increasingly estranged, and we hear much more talk of a supposedly free individual than of egalitarian societies in terms of income or the enjoyment of rights. How far we are from human sensibility when we forget that our main calling must be to stand with the majority, listening to every problem or anguish of our people and understanding even and fundamentally those who think differently. Madam President, I come from a country with a long, faithfully documented tradition in international politics. This tradition includes staunch support for multilateralism in all of its facets, political, economic, cultural, as the best and only way to face the challenges to which I have referred. It also, of course, includes a permanent commitment to international law, a commitment to dialogue and to the building of peace as one of our greatest contributions in the context of a fragmented and polarized world. My country's entire political system is proud to contribute decisively to global tasks such as the maintenance of international peace and security, the consolidation and development of international law through participation in normative bodies and in international courts, through our support for disarmament, food security, global health, and commitment to addressing climate change. In this context, I wish to highlight my country's historic commitment to the multilateral peacekeeping system. In the last 35 years, and without interruption, Uruguay has deployed battalions to various United Nations peace operations. We've taken on this role to such an extent that we've become the leading country in Latin America and the second per capita worldwide in contributing to this type of missions. Moreover, we have done this with particular distinction because our troops have been specialized in the most emblematic role of these peace operations, that is, the protection of civilians in armed conflicts. The nations represented in this assembly are well aware that my small country is very far from standing out for its military might or its economic dominance. And it is there, paradoxically, that our strength lies. Because we are incapable of standing in anyone's way. On the contrary, our strength lies in intangible capacities that this world greatly needs, because we are a country that can be relied upon to promote dialogue and peace. Firstly, because those principles define us as a republic and are evident in our respect for the separation of powers and the rule of law, the strengthening of our democratic system, and our respect and promotion of human rights and social equity, among other things. Secondly, because this is how we have historically conducted ourselves on the international stage. As early as in 1907, for instance, my country took a firm stance at the Hague Conference on Arbitration, seeing it as an essential and obligatory mechanism for resolving conflicts between states. Just a few years later, in 1921, Uruguay was the first state in the world to accept the jurisdiction of the Permanent Court of International Justice, the predecessor of the International Court of Justice. On the basis of these and other historical precedents, I hereby reaffirm that Uruguay is in an excellent position to be able to offer itself to the world as a host for negotiations, as a promoter of networks of dialogue and mediation, leading to the construction of peace and the prevention of conflicts. Believe me, we are prepared for this ever more urgent and necessary challenge. Among other reasons, because we have learned, as my country's former president, Jose Pepe Mujica, said, that tolerance is the foundation for peaceful coexistence. Thank you.
On behalf of the Assembly, I wish to thank the President of the Eastern Republic of Uruguay. The Assembly will hear an address by Her Excellency Natasha Pets-Mushar, the President of the Republic of Slovenia. I request protocol to escort Her Excellency and invite her to address the Assembly.
Madam President, please accept my warmest congratulations on your election at this historic 80th anniversary of the United Nations. Your election underscores the vital importance of including women in the decision-making process. Ladies and gentlemen, excellencies, in 1945, the end of the Second World War was greeted with celebrations, and hopes were placed in a new era of peace and cooperation, embodied by the creation of the United Nations. However, those hopes were soon overshadowed by the onset of the Cold War. When it ended in 1991, we once again dared to believe that this would pave the way to the vision of lasting peace, security, and cooperation as enshrined in the UN Charter. Sadly, that vision has not materialized. In fact, the situation has worsened, and here is why. Firstly, the Security Council, envisioned as the very pillar of collective security, is failing to meet the expectations of the world, if it ever has. The Permanent Five were supposed to be role models for the rest of the world working for peace. Some work in their own interests instead. Secondly, the promise of the Sustainable Development Goals is faltering. Progress is lagging, and with cuts in development assistance, millions of the world's poorest are pushed further away from the access to even the most basic services. Thirdly, international law appears to stand at the precipice of irrelevance. The independence of elected international judges, the integrity of human rights institutions, personal security of human rights defenders, and the authority of this organization are under siege. Fourthly, the Genocide Convention risks becoming a relic of the past. Some states have put the International Criminal Court to its greatest challenge ever. Its prosecutors, whose only duty is the pursuit of justice, and its judges, whose responsibility is to uphold the law, our international law, now face sanctions and intimidation. As if the states that sanction them would prefer to shield the alleged perpetrators of atrocities rather than confront the truth and help deliver justice. Fifthly, the landmark opinion of the International Court of Justice affirming that international law obliges states to prevent harming the climate already feels obsolete. And finally, states are withdrawing from the Paris Climate Agreement, from the Ottawa Treaty, and from the UN agencies, or simply cutting their finances. Each such act chips away at the support for multilateralism, a system designed not for the powerful few, but for the benefit of all of us. Madam President, how are we to explain these trends to our electorates, to our people, and above all, to our children? Shall we tell them that this is the new normal, that might makes right? That the strong may seize what they want, because they can. That they can kill with impunity, because they can, that they may pollute, wage wars, and trample on international law just because they can? Are we prepared to look our children in the eyes and say, this is the world you will inherit and there is nothing we can do about it? With the adoption of the Pact for the Future last year, we have charted a path toward a stronger, more forward-looking United Nations. But we must now create the conditions to fulfill our commitments. One way forward is to establish a permanent advocacy network to give the Pact unconditional, sustained political support. To this end, I propose the creation of a global forum for the future, an inclusive movement of states committed to multilateralism, mutual respect, and the defense of our shared vision. A movement determined to stand up for the Pact and drive its implementation at every level. As states consider how to implement the Pact for the Future, some solutions may be seen as inconvenient today, but in the long run, ladies and gentlemen, they are not optional. They are systemically necessary. The first example is the reform of the Security Council. We all recognize that it is the principal organ entrusted with the maintenance of international peace and security. But what it is not, and must never be, is a body that stands above international law to defend the interests of some at the expense of others. Jus cogens norms must be safeguarded as a matter of principle. If the prohibitions against genocide and crimes against humanity are accepted as jus cogens norms, can any permanent member claim a legitimate veto right in such circumstances? Member states have attempted to address this question through many reform proposals, but with minimal progress. This is why we must dare to go further now. We, the General Assembly, must take a bold step and request an advisory opinion from the International Court of Justice on this very question. Second, we must confront the gap between our words and actions on gender equity. Progress has been made, but far too modestly. Over the past 80 years, 13% of leaders in multilateral organizations have been women. And no woman has ever served as Secretary General of the United Nations. And this, ladies and gentlemen, must change. So, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, let us make history. Today, the 80th session of the General Assembly is led by only the 5th woman to hold the presidency. By the end of this session, she would be joined by a Madam Secretary General-elect, a living proof to 4 billion women that even the most impossible job is not beyond their reach. But gender representation is not enough. What we must achieve is actual gender equity because it benefits not only women and girls, but entire societies. True equity requires systemic change, and so women's empowerment must remain at the heart of our global agenda. International organizations must weave a gender perspective into every strand of policy making. And that should be a result of effective participation of women and girls themselves. Electing a Madam Secretary General would be historic, but it must only be the beginning of a much deeper transformation. Madam President, the Pact for the Future sets out clearly what must be done to change our world for the better. I have mentioned only 2 of the many challenges we must confront decisively. But we can only succeed as a community if we accept that there is no future for humanity without a fundamental change. The mandate of the Global Forum for the Future would be to push towards such a change. This is why it must be inclusive. It must not be merely a coalition of countries. It must inspire hundreds of millions of people. For when it comes to human dignity, the constituency of like-minded individuals is vast diverse, and knows no borders. Human dignity is indivisible. We must fight for it no matter how great the obstacles are. And there are many, we know that. Think of hunger. Time and again, humanity rose across continents to confront the scourge of hunger, to no avail. Worse still, hunger is now being weaponized, turned into a tool of war. We receive reports on a daily basis of how women and children are starved because they are marked as legitimate targets, as enemies. How cruel, how inhumane is that, ladies and gentlemen? We cannot allow this to happen any longer. 40 years ago, musicians stood against hunger. Instead of guns, they, the Band Aid, used music. The world heard them, but they were not loud enough, as hunger has not been eradicated. Today, we have science. We can address on a scale beyond imagination not only hunger, but every act of violence against human beings and all human fears. Granted, science, technology, and global connectivity are too often twisted by cynical leaders and warmongering regimes. But they can also be harnessed for the common good. Artists, influencers, and visionaries with audiences of millions can join forces with the governments of like-minded nations. Together, their voice in defense of humanity could become irresistible. Together, we can demand real action by all governments, all world and community leaders on the pact for the future, and hold to account those who betray human dignity to its very core, through wars of aggression, genocidal policies, and crimes against humanity. If we join forces and make ourselves heard, nobody can ignore us, not even the most arrogant governments and individual politicians. Of course, such initiatives cannot emerge out of thin air. They require leadership, strong, inclusive, and fearless leadership. We, the leaders of today, are only transient custodians of power. Some of us may not be here after the next election, but that is precisely why we must act now. Our responsibility and destiny will be judged by how we treat our planet and its people today. We simply cannot afford silence, ignorance, or passivity, not while we hold power and possess the power of the word. Hesitation is not an option, Madam President. For most of us, members of the UN, is not might that makes right. It is the opposite. We must not allow the powerful few to ignore us. We must not surrender to a world where power alone prevails. We, the majority of United Nations members, must be role models. We must work for a different world. The Global Forum for the Future can be a platform for the much-needed transformation in which partnerships with non-state actors and companies are indispensable. Profits must finally serve development for all. Innovation and sustainability must drive tolerance, mutual respect, and inclusive dialogue. Is that too much to ask? If we, the leaders of this planet, can offer nothing but terror, conflict, pollution, fear, inequalities, and war to 8 billion people, then we must confront the truth. We are complicit in crimes against our civilization and our planet. And not just us, heads of states, but leaders of international institutions, CEOs, and every individual with the power to make a difference share this responsibility. None of us can claim ignorance of what is at stake. If we believe in human dignity for all, we must deliver more. A world that fulfills lives, not threatens them. We must say yes to inclusive multilateralism and a resounding no to multipolarism. Let us show that this General Assembly can and will make a difference, as it has often done before. Let us demonstrate that we reject arrogance, hatred, and willful blindness to a lack of equality and justice, to wars of aggression, crimes against humanity, and genocide, because they tear us apart for generations. And let us proclaim in all seriousness and sincerity that we embrace personal and collective responsibility to uphold humanity, sustainable development, and international law, because this will keep us together as a civilization for generations. And Madam President, let me end on a personal note. For the sake of future generations, to fulfill our responsibility as human beings, to ensure that we are on the right side of the history, we should do the right thing. We did not stop the Holocaust. We did not stop the genocide in Rwanda. We did not stop the genocide in Srebrenica. We must stop the genocide in Gaza. There are no excuses anymore. None. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much.
On behalf of the Assembly, I wish to thank the President of the Republic of Slovenia. The Assembly will hear an address by His Excellency Kasim Jomart Tokayev, the President of the Republic of Kazakhstan. I request protocol to escort His Excellency and invite him to address the Assembly.
Madam President, Mr. Secretary General, distinguished delegates, for 8 decades, the United Nations has played a pivotal role in combating humanity's global challenges. Over that time, it has led our common efforts on collective security, nuclear non-proliferation, peacekeeping, development, poverty reduction, sustainability, and human rights. But we must also face the truth. The world around us has changed profoundly and, unfortunately, not for the better. That's why the United Nations remains today a symbol of hope for millions around the globe. This historic meeting is a unique opportunity to recommit ourselves to the founding principles and goals of our universal and truly indispensable organization. However, we cannot turn a blind eye to the real crisis thrust in multilateral institutions. Serious violations of international law have become new normality, which undermines global stability and erodes confidence between peoples, between political leaders, and between states. In this challenging time, we all must empower the United Nations to make it more adjustable to the realities of today's unpredictable world. The spirit of mutual understanding and eagerness to cooperate must prevail over dangerous warmongering. State leaders have a responsibility to move toward making peace. A failure of the current generation of leaders to act is not an option, because future generations will pay a much greater price. In this regard, comprehensive reform of the United Nations is a strategic necessity, not a subject for endless contemplations. We need to establish a new group of truly dedicated people who will highly professionally and without any hesitations make concrete proposals for reforming the United Nations to make it better suited to the challenges of today and objectives of tomorrow. A central pillar of this bold effort to renew the United Nations should be a reform of the Security Council. Major powers of Asia, Africa, and Latin America should be represented in the Security Council on the rotational basis. In addition, Kazakhstan strongly believes that the voices of responsible middle powers also need to be seriously amplified in the Security Council. In fact, they have already started to play a larger positive role in international relations, bringing balance and building trust. They can act as bridges within the United Nations when major powers are divided or failing to resolve pressing issues of common concern. Above all, a credible United Nations for the 21st century requires member states to take concrete steps toward durable peace and security. Otherwise, the United Nations is doomed to forever mitigate consequences while root causes forever proliferate. We can begin this process already today by reaffirming our steadfast commitment to the Charter of the United Nations. The founding principles of sovereignty, territorial integrity, and peaceful resolution of disputes must be upheld without exception. Selective application of the Charter undermines its credibility. The world needs a new consensus based on trust, inclusiveness, and shared responsibility. For example, the enemy state clauses of the Charter, historical remnants of the Second World War, have already been recognized by the overwhelming majority of the international community is obsolete. For all these reasons, it's time to have a serious conversation about Charter review. Today we face an alarming reality. Arms control treaties are collapsing, and with them, so are the foundations of strategic stability. Global military spending in 2024 hit a record $2.7 trillion. The global cost of violence reached nearly $20 trillion. Therefore, rebuilding a robust global security architecture should remain a top priority for the international community. We advocate relaunching high-level dialogue among nuclear powers and stronger multilateral action to drastically reduce the looming threat of nuclear weapons. More widely, we must begin the hard work of getting rid of the militant mindset. We can do so by tracking closely how much our countries invest in peace. Kazakhstan is ready to host a new dialogue on nuclear disarmament and non-proliferation. We can focus on informal, inclusive exchanges that reinforce the NPT and support progress toward the CTBT. We also call to advance our proposal to establish international agency for biological safety and security. Kazakhstan remains concerned by the Ukrainian crisis, which continues to seriously harm civilians, damage global trust, and undermine international security. Nonetheless, bilateral and international diplomatic efforts on this conflict should continue along with political flexibility to meet the long-term interests of both states. Territorial disputes are never easy to resolve and require mutual restraint and responsibility for the sake of future generations. The psychology of animosity drags all involved in conflicts to the abyss, leaving no chance to reach peace. The humanitarian crisis in Gaza has reached a disastrous scale that cannot be ignored. This conflict stems from a complex historical background. We cannot ignore the root cause of this belligerence. Kazakhstan calls for full protection of all civilians and unhindered humanitarian access in strict compliance with international humanitarian law. We reaffirm our support of the two-state solution, with the United Nations playing a central role. Kazakhstan acknowledges diplomatic initiatives aimed at regional reconciliation in the Middle East, including the Arab Peace Initiative, the New York Declaration, and the Abraham Accords, and others. They demonstrate that leadership and political will can turn division into cooperation and shared benefit. We also welcome the normalization of relations between Azerbaijan and Armenia under the mediation of the United States President. It shows that even entrenched conflicts can be settled through diplomacy and common sense. Guided by this principle, Kazakhstan consistently favors diplomacy over escalation and dialogue over force. Current geopolitical tensions sometimes tempt some leaders to claim that a clash of civilizations is inevitable. Yet, these divisions are not fact or fate. They are political choices. Global public goods, such as science, medicine, sports, religion, and culture, should not become subjects of geopolitical divisions and sanctions. These spheres of human activity bind us together under a humanitarian umbrella. When political leaders make irresponsible statements or take reckless decisions, manipulating religion and identity for political gain, they in fact seriously damage the trust and goodwill in striving for peace. Political leadership must be rooted in mutual understanding and respect, not mutual suspicion and arrogance. Tolerance and wisdom are the foundation of lasting peace and must be upheld through the rule of law. Dear friends and colleagues, we observe a growing fragmentation and political bias of investment flows. As a result, global FDI fell to $1.5 trillion last year. Kazakhstan strongly advocates for greater international investment cooperation. More than $400 billion have been attracted to our economy within 30 years of independence. Our commitment to open market principles is absolutely firm and will remain a cornerstone of our state policy. Located in the very center of Eurasia, Kazakhstan is poised to play a crucial role as a logistic hub, handling 80% of all overland transit between Asia and Europe. We are investing tens of billions of dollars in our transport and transit infrastructure, including the Belt and Road Initiative, the North-South and Trans-Caspian transit corridors. Kazakhstan will continue to develop regional supply chains that are the heart of the emerging global transport network. By 2029, we plan to build 5,000 kilometers of new railway lines. Kazakhstan has made the Sustainable Development Goals a core pillar of its national agenda, integrating their targets into state planning and budgeting. With the support of the United Nations Secretary General and partner states, Kazakhstan now hosts the new United Nations Regional Center for SDGs for Central Asia and Afghanistan in Almaty. Today, Central Asia is demonstrating a renewed sense of unity and mutual trust. It is emerging as a proactive contributor to international peace and progress. The Central Asian Five are strengthening cooperation, proving that regional solidarity can be a powerful force for development and security. This has enabled our region to engage key global partners in the unique Central Asia Plus dialogue format. Kazakhstan believes that inclusive development in Afghanistan is a basis for long-term regional peace and stability. We continue to support the Afghan people through humanitarian assistance and cooperation in trade, food security, infrastructure, and transport connectivity. Distinguished delegates, last year was the hottest year in human history, and Central Asia is warming at twice the global rate. The melting of glaciers in the Alatau Mountains is accelerating, multiplying threats to water and food security for millions. Kazakhstan has drawn profound lessons from the tragedy of the Aral Sea. Thanks to our consistent efforts, including at the international level, we succeeded in preserving the northern part of the sea. As the current chair of the International Fund for Saving the Aral Sea, Kazakhstan will continue to play a proactive role in this common priority. Meanwhile, the Caspian Sea is rapidly shrinking. It is no longer just a regional concern. It is a global warning signal. Therefore, we call for urgent steps to preserve the Caspian water resources with our partners across the region and the wider international community. Last year, Kazakhstan co-organized the One Water Summit with France, Saudi Arabia, and the World Bank. Looking forward, stronger coordination, investments, and sustainable solutions are urgently needed to prevent future water crises. To help advance this agenda, Kazakhstan will host a regional ecological summit in Astana in April next year, to be convened in partnership with the United Nations and other international organizations. As part of our broader environmental commitment, Kazakhstan is implementing a nationwide Clean Kazakhstan campaign. This national movement mobilizes millions of volunteers in cleanup actions, waste reduction, and eco-education. At this initiative of Kazakhstan, the United Nations declared 2026 the International Year of Volunteers for Sustainable Development. We invite all member states to collaborate on this important endeavor. In this spirit, I propose that the General Assembly adopt a resolution proclaiming April 22 as the International Day of Greening the Planet. Dear friends, Kazakhstan views artificial intelligence not as one more technological advancement, but as a major breakthrough that can be a true engine of human progress. Yet, as artificial intelligence accelerates, so do the related risks, specifically deepening technological, economic, and geopolitical divides. At the same time, we should not let ethical norms fall behind this rapid evolution. Pressing questions of fairness, accountability, and individual rights must be addressed with clarity and urgency. We must act collectively to ensure that every country can benefit from AI. Kazakhstan welcomes the establishment under UN auspices of the Global Dialogue on AI Governance. We stand ready to actively contribute to this platform to help ensure that AI remains safe, inclusive, and human-centered. In Kazakhstan, artificial intelligence will be integrated across all sectors of economy and public services. The basic infrastructure to deliver this plan is being built, and our bright young people are getting ready to turn this vision into reality. Our strategic goal is to transform Kazakhstan into a fully digital power within the next 3 years. Large-scale digitalization and widespread use of AI have become a national priority in Kazakhstan. E-government is an important pillar of our national development strategy. Around 90% of public services are already digitalized. Kazakhstan has recently launched its fastest national supercomputer ever. But AI and automation are expected to threaten jobs in many countries. That's why digital progress must go hand in hand with professional education. Therefore, Kazakhstan believes it is imperative not just to increase employment, but to valorize the technical professions. Ladies and gentlemen, amid global turbulence, Kazakhstan is pursuing a bold national renewal to build a truly just and fair state. Over the last 3 years, we have carried out large-scale political and economic reforms that are unprecedented in our part of the world. Through a national referendum, we introduced a single 7-year presidential term, thereby strengthening democratic accountability. We remain committed to the formula of strong president, influential parliament, and accountable government. Guided by strong wish to modernize Kazakhstan, I have proposed a single-chamber parliament for a national referendum to consider. Our objective is to continuously embrace the political system to make it more transparent, effective, and reflective of people's aspirations. At the heart of these reforms lies a clear principle: law and order must prevail. We believe that only governance rooted in common sense and the rule of law can ensure public order and protect the rights of all citizens. It creates good conditions for international investment, trade, cooperation, and more broadly, the dynamic development of our country. The interests of law-abiding people and decent citizens must always come first, maintained through justice, accountability, and mutual respect. Kazakhstan's economy is showing clear signs of sustainability and resilience. This year, economic growth is expected to exceed 6%, underscoring the sustainability of our economy as the largest in our part of the world. But we are not complacent. We will continue our efforts to ensure a long-term growth. Kazakhstan's energy strategy is based on 4 pillars: oil and gas, coal, uranium, and critical minerals. These precious assets are the basis of reliable energy partnerships. Climate change and the green agenda cannot be accepted by all countries that have huge deposits like coal, which nowadays can be cleaned up by advanced technologies. That's why we have committed to decarbonize our country in 35 years. Renewable energy is not the single solution to all energy problems. Agriculture is another driver of our development with huge potential for global markets. Kazakhstan's grain export capacity has amounted to 12 million tons, reaching a great number of international markets, creating new opportunities for trade expansion using enhanced transport connectivity. We will continue our cooperation with all major international partners and regional stakeholders to further diversify our external trade and economy, making it more inclusive and resilient. Excellencies, we will remain firmly on this path, deepening governance reforms at home while supporting global governance abroad. Kazakhstan will continue to serve as a bridge builder and peacemaker. It will also continue to choose balance over domination, cooperation over confrontation, and peace over war. We stand ready in cooperation with other players, stakeholders in the international community to renew the promise of the United Nations as a beacon of peace, justice, and cooperation. Thank you very much.
On behalf of the Assembly, I wish to thank the President of the Republic of Kazakhstan. The Assembly will hear an address by His Excellency Matamela Cyril Ramaphosa, President of the Republic of South Africa. I request protocol to escort His Excellency and invite him to address the Assembly.
Thank you, President of the 80th session of the UN General Assembly, United Nations Secretary General, Excellencies, heads of state and government, and ladies and gentlemen. 80 years ago, the United Nations was established to save succeeding generations of humanity from the scourge of war and to build a peaceful, prosperous, and just world arising from the devastation brought about by global conflict. Through the UN Charter, the nations of the world pledged to uphold peace, development, and human rights, which would be underpinned by international law. Now more than ever, we are called upon to uphold the values and advance the purpose of the United Nations. We are also called upon to advance cooperation and solidarity between nations. We are called upon to promote multilateralism and safeguard the institutions that enable it. South Africa's engagement in the international sphere echoes our domestic imperatives of eradicating poverty, reducing unemployment, and addressing the root causes of inequality. instruments to mobilize domestic resources for development. It is concerning that geopolitical shocks and unprecedented trade policy volatility are destabilizing the global economy and jeopardizing a critical source of development finance. In fact, the economy and jeopardizing a critical source of development finance. In fact, trade is now being used as a weapon against a number of countries in the world. We must redouble our efforts to strengthen the link between trade and development. Unilateral trade practices and economic cohesion have a detrimental impact on many nations. This includes the economic embargo against Cuba